Good morning, everybody. Whoa, that's loud. Morning. So I'm going to grab this if that's okay. How's everybody feeling today? All right. Have a good breakfast. Did you enjoy the sausages? I thought they were very good. Welcome, y'all. I love that. This, by the way, is my favorite name of any UX conference I've ever been to, I just want to say. So welcome, y'all, to UX Y'all. I'm very proud and honored to open up the day today by talking to you about design for cognitive bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. If you want to use them for evil, we can discuss that later, but this talk is about using them for good. The hashtag for this, if you want to tweet while talks are going on, is Fight Bias, as well as the UX Y'all hashtag. My name is David Dillon Thomas. I'm the principal of content strategy at Think Company. We're an experienced design firm. And for the purposes of this talk, it's also important to know that I am the creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast, which is a podcast about, wait for it, cognitive bias. So I want to talk a little bit about how I came to be the host of this podcast. A few years ago, I saw an amazing talk by Iris Bonnet called Gender Equality by Design. And one of the things she talked about is this idea that a lot of gender bias and racial bias come down to something as simple as pattern recognition. And what I mean by that is, let's say you are hiring a web developer. And in your head, when you think web developer, skinny white dude pops into your head, right? And the reason that skinny white dude is popping into your head is because that's the pattern you've seen your whole life on TV, in the office. If it's a web developer, that's what they look like. And it's not because you think that's the only person who's allowed to be a web developer. You know, you are a fairly woke, liberal person. You voted for Hillary or whatever. But the pattern has been set up in your head, in your subconscious. And so when you see a resume and the name at the top of that resume is not something that sounds like skinny white dude, you give it a little bit of a side eye. And again, not because you intend to, but it's just that's the pattern. It doesn't fit the pattern. It feels weird. So when I learned that something as pernicious as racial bias or gender bias could come down to something as fundamental and simple and human as pattern recognition, I decided I needed to learn everything I could about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is the Rational Wiki page, a list of cognitive biases, well over 100. And I took one look at that and I realized there is no way I'm gonna get through all of this in a day. So I did one a day. One a day for like a year. I looked at these biases and learned whatever I can. I picked one and I learned. And this turned me inevitably into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. So my friends eventually were like, Dave, please, just get a podcast. So that's what I did. It's worth discussing then what is cognitive bias, right? And at the end of the day, it's basically a set of shortcuts your mind takes. Your mind takes shortcuts to get through the day. It has to. Every day you make something like 1 trillion decisions. Right now, right, I'm deciding where I'm gonna look, how fast I'm gonna talk, where I'm gonna step. If I had to think carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd just dissolve into a puddle of goo right here. So your mind takes shortcuts, right? Now that's usually a good thing, but sometimes those shortcuts can lead to errors, and those errors are what we call cognitive biases. A fairly harmless example is illusion of control. So let's say that you are playing a game that involves rolling a die. If you need a high number, you'll roll that die really hard. If you need a lower number, you'll roll it really soft. Now, I think everyone here knows it makes no difference, right, how hard or soft you throw the die, but to your brain it just makes sense because we like to think we can control things, and so we embody that. Another weird one is reactance. It's the you can't tell me what to do bias. And if I were to write on, or if I were to put a sign on that wall that said, please do not write on this wall, and then I put a sign on that wall that said, under no circumstances should you write on this wall. Which wall do you think is gonna get the most graffiti, right? And a really weird version of this, and I will caveat this has not been replicated to my knowledge, but it's too wacky not to tell, is you have a hallway. And at the end of the hallway is some candy, a whole bunch of different kinds of candy. And I say, okay, go down the hallway, and when you get to the candy, you can have 3 pieces of candy, pick any candy you want. And most people will go down to the hallway and go get the candy, and they'll get their favorite candy, 3 of the same thing. However, if I make that hallway weirdly narrow, and you go down it, and you get to the candy, you're much more likely to pick 3 different pieces of candy, even if they're not your favorite kind of candy. And what they think is going on is that by making that hallway weirdly narrow, I make you feel like I'm taking away your options, and you don't like that. So when you get to the end of the hallway, you show your freedom the only way you can by, damn it, getting 3 different pieces of candy, because you can't tell me what to do. We are so weird. One bias that I find really, how do I make things go forward? Really interesting from a design point of view is survivorship bias. So a good example of this is there was a refugee during World War II, a very smart mathematician, and he was asked by the Army to help them figure out where should we put the armament on our planes to keep them from getting shot down, right? And they had all these planes with all these bullet holes in them and said, hey, take a look at these planes, help us figure out how we can better arm them. And there were a whole bunch of scientists and mathematicians in the room, and they looked at the planes and said, well, you see where the bullet holes are? Put the armament there. They won't get shot down. And our refugee scientist friend took one look at that and said, no, you should be putting it where the bullet holes aren't. Because he realized they were looking at the planes that made it back. What they should be concerned about is the planes that got shot up so bad they crashed and never made it back. And obviously, they got hit where the bullet holes are not. They were looking at the survivors and using that to pass judgment on everything. And we do this all the time. And I had a lesson in this early on in my design career when I was helping design a website, and we had this wonderful homepage. And I'm like, this is the best homepage ever. The client is going to love this. And then the client did not love this. So we had to change it and change it and change it. And 5 versions later, we got what is actually now on the web. And then I realized, wait a minute, how much of the rest of the web is like 5th or 6th choices? In fact, how much of the built world around us is the 7th or 8th choice after committee? I mean, look around you right now. This is probably not the original design of this ballroom. This is the 6th or 7th version that eventually people were able to agree on. So it was a really good lesson in what you see in front of you is not the only version that ever was. Confirmation bias is one that I think most people here have heard of. It is exactly what you think it is. You have an idea in your head, and you're so convinced it's true. You never look for anything to unconfirm it. You only look for evidence to support what you already believe. If you see anything you disagree with, you say fake news and you move on. So a very powerful example of this came during the Iraq War. So as you know, the whole idea was we need to go to Iraq because there are weapons of mass destruction. I even bought into this. I'm like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. As it turned out, not so much. And even when the President of the United States said there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the number of people who believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq went up. That is how powerful this bias can be. We're going to come back to it. Now, these are very difficult to combat. Part of the problem is you may not even know that you have the bias. In fact, there's a bias called the bias blind spot that basically goes like this. I don't have a bias, but I'm pretty sure all of you do. And part of the reason you don't see it is because about 90% of cognition happens below the threshold of conscious thought. Like I said, you are very much mostly running on autopilot. In fact, some scientists think that's actually a conservative estimate. So if anyone ever asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you do know you have the bias, this is kind of the worst part. Even if you know you've got the bias, you're probably going to do it anyway. So there's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could have everybody in this room write down the last 2 numbers of your social security number. And then I could say, oh, by the way, I'd like you to bid on this bottle of wine. And if you wrote down 2 numbers that are kind of low, you'll bid lower for the wine. If you wrote down 2 numbers that are kind of high, you'll bid higher for the bottle of wine. It's anchoring, it's a thing we do. Now here's the thing. I could start out that experiment by saying, hey, there's this thing called anchoring, here's how it works, please don't do it, and you'll still do it. It gets worse. I could start out the experiment by saying, hey, here's this thing called anchoring, and I will pay you cash money not to do it, you will still do it. Now, why do we care? As people who are designers, UX practitioners, people who make things, why should we care about bias? It's because of a little thing called choice architecture. And the way it works, a good example is you go buy some produce at the grocery store. And I think just about everybody here knows you never go for the produce that's right up top, right? Because that's the produce that the grocer is trying to get rid of. And so they put it in a place that's easy to access because they know most people will reach for what's right in front of them, right? They have architected that experience so that it'll be to their advantage because they know something about human behavior. They could just as easily have architected it to advantage the user and put the really fresh produce where it's easiest to access, right? But the idea is that you architect things in a way that takes advantage of human bias. There are, in fact, decisions your user needs to make, and we are very much in the business of helping people make decisions. So it's really important to think about how people make decisions, and not how we think they make decisions as rational actors, because there is no such thing as a rational actor. It's important to understand what we've learned about how people make decisions if we really want to help them make better decisions. And it turns out there are content and design choices we can make that can keep harmful cognitive biases at bay, or maybe even sometimes use them for good. So I want to talk about a few of those examples. So let's go back to the resume, right? And as it turns out, you can have two identical resumes, right? The only thing that's different is the name at the top of the resume. And in experiment after experiment, if it's a stereotypically male field, the name with the resume with the male name on top gets moved up the chain. The resume with the female named stays in the pile. But why do we need that information? Right? If I'm a hiring manager, what is it helping me to know the name at the top of the resume? And as a content strategist, I like to think of this as a pure signal versus noise problem, right? The signal is the qualifications, the experience. The noise is whatever I'm reading into the name for race or gender. Now, as it turns out, the city of Philadelphia did a round of blind hiring for a web developer position, and they learned two things very quickly. One is, if you want to blind a resume, the best way to do it is to have an intern who has zero stake in the hiring process physically print out the resume and then get a marker and redact it like a CAA document. The second thing they learned, how many of you are familiar with GitHub? All right. So if you were hiring a web developer, one of the first things you do is you look at their GitHub profile. So they would see a redacted resume with qualifications they liked, and they say, well, let's go check out this person's GitHub profile. And what is the very next thing that would happen? Exactly. You'd see all the personal information in the experiment was ruined. So clever people that they are, they wrote a script, a Chrome plugin, that would eliminate all of the personal data, blind it as the page loaded, and then just to complete the circle, they put that code back on GitHub, and it's there now if you ever want to use it to try this yourselves. Now, this isn't just about making humans better at hiring. It's about making AI better at hiring. So Amazon had a little resume bot, and it was there to help hiring managers, cut down on the noise and really just look at the most important resumes. And they discovered a very curious thing where, for some reason, the hiring bot really preferred men. And they looked into it and tried to figure out, okay, why this is. And they said, okay, well, what did we train the AI on? They trained it on the last 5 years of resumes. What do you think the last 5 years of resumes all had in common? They were mostly submitted by men. So hiring bot took one look at that and said, gee, you sure must like dudes. I guess I'll just recommend dudes. And that's what it did. To the point where if it saw a woman's college on the list of education, it would assume it was a woman and then not hire them. So it was very good at its job. It was just very sexist at its job. So we need to be very careful about how we think about hiring, not just for ourselves, but when it gets to the level of AI, you're basically scaling that bias in a crazy way. On the flip side of that, right, you get service design. And so there's a wonderful article written by this woman about how she went to one of the Amazon Go stores. And the Amazon Go stores, basically you walk in, you take what you want, and you leave. and Amazon automagically charges you for what you took. No cashiers. Now, some people of color may be able to tell you stories of how when they do retail shopping, they experience somewhat aggressive help from the cashiers, right? A lot of, really, what are you here for? Can I help you? Please, can I help you? Right? It gets a little microaggression-y, right? She experienced none of this because there were no cashiers to treat her differently than the other customers. So in a weird way, perhaps unintentionally, they architected the experience in such a way that they eliminated the bias because they actually eliminated the people. We are seeing this play out in the judicial system as well. San Francisco in July started to implement what they called blind charging. And the basic idea is that a DA has an incredible amount of power when it comes to whether or not they decide to prosecute. They can decide not to. And as it turns out, in cases where the offender was white, they were far less likely to decide to prosecute. So they noticed this and they decided, okay, do you really need to know that information when you look at the police report? So they eliminated the race and name of the perpetrator, the race and name of the assailant, and then the location of the crime as well. They blinded it the same way we blinded that resume. Now, we have yet to see what the results of this experiment are. Like I said, it just started, but it's going to be really interesting to note if this affects that ratio. I want to talk for a bit about cognitive fluency, because this affects our jobs in a big way. The basic idea behind cognitive fluency is that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, we will assume whatever it's talking about is going to be easy to do. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I'm going to assume whatever it's talking about is going to be hard to do. Now, I love pancakes. I make pancakes. If I had the time and the resources, I would make all of you pancakes. I worked for a year on my recipe. It's amazing. This is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of small, kind of clumped together, kind of hard to read. Before I read word one of that, I take a look at that and I say, that looks like it's going to be hard to read. I bet pancakes are hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. Now, if something has a lot of photos and the text is really spaced apart, I might take a look at that and think, that looks easy to read. And again, it could be the exact same text as the first one. That looks easy to read. I bet pancakes are easy to make. I think I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video? Forget it, we're making pancakes. Now, when it comes to stuff we actually have to do, this becomes important. I take one look at that EZ form, right? And I say, taxes are impossible. There's no way I'm going to do this. I'm going to wait until the last minute, or maybe a little bit further, before I try that. I look at the beautiful, clean white space of the Intuit TurboTax interface, and I say, you know what? I bet taxes aren't all that hard. I might start this weekend. But yeah, and then things just start going backwards really fast. Pretend you're not seeing any of this. It's all surprises. Big surprises, so many spoilers. Okay. All right, everybody has to vote, one way or another. Decide now. How many people think that there are 53 African nations in the United Nations? All right? Okay, all right. How many people think there are 55 African nations in the United Nations? All right? Okay. Typically, those are fairly even, but typically people will favor the 55 African nations. And the reason is, sad as it is, oh, by the way, there are only 54. You both got it completely wrong. The reason is, if something is easier to read, we assume it's more true. It gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. This has consequences. So, what's happening is that we love certainty. I've studied like over 100 cognitive biases, and the theme that keeps coming back is we love certainty, and we hate uncertainty. And we will throw logic under the bus. We will throw other people under the bus to get to certainty. And things that are easy for our mind to retrieve feel more certain, feel more true. If I asked you, hey, what did you get for your birthday when you were 5? You might not be that sure. I might say, you got a truck, right? And you'd be like, I don't know about that, right? If I were to ask you what you had for breakfast, you could be pretty clear about that. You could be pretty certain. It's like, I remember definitely having those scrambled eggs, and you feel sure, because it's easy to retrieve that memory. The same thing goes for stuff that rhymes, because stuff that rhymes is easier to remember, it's easier to retrieve. Stuff that's written in a clear font and plain language, it's easier to retrieve, and I just equate that with, oh, well, it must be true. Now, this becomes really important when it comes to information that you must believe. Most African Americans do not believe health information that comes from the government. Back in 2002, they took a look at this, and the number of African Americans who agreed with the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, was at 37%. By 2016, that had dropped to 18%. Now, we could do a whole other talk about the legit reasons African Americans would have suspicions about health information coming from the government, but this is information that could save lives. So if that means it needs to be written in a clear font, if that means it needs to use plain language, hell, if that means it needs to rhyme, then so be it, because this is information that could save lives. Now, as it turns out, the federal government released the Plain Language Act of 2010, and it actually says, if you are a website receiving funds from the government to provide services, you would better talk about those services using plain language. And if you have any question about what they mean by plain language, 18F has produced some amazing guidelines around how to think about that. Another weird thing, if you have a sale price and it's right next to the original price, versus having the sale price be a little bit further away from the original price, I'll think it's a better deal, even if it's the exact same sale. Again, we're so weird. The name pronunciation effect. So this is another case of, if it's easy to pronounce, I will actually prefer it, right? And caveat, easy to pronounce is a cultural norm, so assuming within your culture it's easy to pronounce. But if it's easier to pronounce, that will affect my voting behavior. That will affect all sorts of things that it really shouldn't affect. But again, my mind likes it when you make things easy for me. One of my favorite versions of this is at a law firm. The higher up you go in the chain, the easier the names get to pronounce. It even affects stocks. So if you have an IPO, right, and you have a new stock on the market, if the name of the stock is easier to pronounce, it will do better. In fact, if the abbreviation is easier to pronounce, it will do better. I want to talk a little bit about primacy, right? Where are things on the page? So primacy is a bias where basically it's really easy to remember at the beginning of the list and not the middle of a list. And we tend to give more authority to things that are higher up, right, in a list or on the page. And Amazon ran into this when they were trying to introduce reviews. And originally, they would put the most recent review at the top, which was fine, except everyone assumed that that review was the most authoritative review because it was at the top. That had absolutely nothing to do with how authoritative it was, but they just assumed that. So Amazon came up with a concept called helpfulness. And they said, okay, we'll let people rate how helpful was this review. So we'll put the most helpful review at the top, right? That made things a little better, except now people assumed that the most helpful review, if it was positive, oh, this must be a good product, and if it was negative, oh, this must be a bad product. So they decided to put the most helpful positive review right next to the most helpful negative review, and this gave them equal visual weight, which in the user's mind gave them equal authority, and they had to consider both sides. The bandwagon effect is one that you probably are familiar with, and it's exactly what you think it is. If a whole bunch of people are doing something, you think you should be doing it too, and it's surprisingly powerful. So if I show you this and I say, okay, this is exhibit 1, A, B, or C, which one is most like exhibit 1? And most people will say A, right? Here's the thing. I'm going to put you in a room with 12 other people, and you go last. And the other 12 people go first, and they say B. So by the time I get to you, you say B? Now here's how you get around the bandwagon effect. If I have just one other person in that room who says A, you are more likely to say A. You need just one more confidant, one more mutual dissenter, right? Courage is contagious, like scientifically, it actually is. For you to feel the confidence you need to say, it's A, I'm not crazy, these other people are crazy. Now this is really important if we're designing interfaces that rely on consensus, that rely on people being able to discuss an issue rationally. You need to make sure that the dissenters have line of sight to each other. Or you need to make sure that nobody has line of sight to each other at all. And this comes out in the real world too when we're doing exercises with stakeholders where we need them to discuss things and give their honest feedback, right? So let's say we're doing a retrospective and we have to talk about what went right, what went wrong, what can we do better next time. If I say, okay, let's talk about what went right, and I have everyone raise their hand, and the most powerful person in the room raises their hand and says, I think this went right, and there's other people in the room who think that did not go right, they're not going to say anything because the most powerful person in the room said, hey, this was great, right? But if I have everyone write down on little sticky notes what they thought went well, now I can take that and put it up on a wall and get qualitative and quantitative around what actually went right without worrying about the bandwagon effect. By far, in my opinion, the most dangerous bias in the world is the framing effect. And it starts out innocent enough. Let's say you go to a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean. Next to that, you see a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which beef do you buy? Right? 95% lean. It's the same thing. But I framed it in a way to influence your decision. Now that's fine when it comes to beef, but what if I were to say, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? See what I did there? We're no longer discussing whether or not it's a good idea to even go to war. And I guarantee you wars have been started over less. Now, how many people here are bilingual or speak more than one language at all? All right. You all have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you think about the decision in your non-native language, you are less likely to fall for the framing effect. So I speak a little bit of French, and if I try to think about the beef decision in French, it'll go something like this. Beef, that's bœuf, that's a lot of vowels. 95%, that's 89, maybe? And by the time I've worked through all that in my brain, I can see very clearly that it's a scam. If I try to think about it in my fluent language, I go through it really quickly, I don't even notice the illusion. And a lot of this is really what cognitive bias comes down to. There's a great book written by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. You should read it and skip this whole lecture. It's all of the things you'll need. But what it all ends up coming back to is when you think about something slowly, right, rationally, you're able to see through a lot of these illusions. It's thinking fast that gets us in trouble in the first place. And we have limited resources to think through things slowly. Like I said, we can't do it with everything, but we need to be really careful about what we do decide to think through quickly, because it can get us and our users in trouble. Now, you can actually use this bias for good. There's an experiment where I show this photo to an audience, and I say, should this person drive this car? And what ensues is a policy discussion. And some people in the room are saying, oh, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And there are other people who are saying, oh, that's ageist, people should be able to do what they want. And all I'll learn by the end of that is who is on what side. Now, I can show the exact same photo to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what'll ensue is a design discussion. And some people will say, well, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? Or other people will say, well, what if we moved where the dashboard was? And what I'll learn by the end of that conversation is a few different ways that that person might actually be able to drive that car. I have reframed the conversation, and really just by changing a couple of words. But it has an incredibly powerful effect. In fact, I could just ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that was why that person was in the car in the first place. It was because they were here, and they wanted to be there. And if I frame it this way, we can discuss things like public transportation. Another place we see this is in teacher recommendation, teacher evaluations, which is another part of the universe where women are not treated well. Women typically are given poorer evaluations than men, even in equivalent classes, and if you control for everything else. So one group tried just a little change to the framing so that when you got the survey, it had just a little, like 2 or 3 sentences about, hey, by the way, women are usually treated poorly in these things. Take that into consideration. And lo and behold, the ratings, specifically the ratings coming from men, curiously, went up and were much more balanced than they were before. I want to talk for a minute about dark patterns. Are people familiar with the term dark patterns? So for those of you who are not, dark patterns are basically me using my UX wiles to get you to do something that you don't really want to do, but that I really want you to do. So here's an example, right? I look at this, and at a glance, it seems like the email is part of the authentication process. Like I have to put that email address in there the same way I have to do the CAPTCHA and I have to agree to the privacy policy. They've just kind of tucked it in there, when in fact, no, I'm just signing up for some marketing trash. I want to talk about this because there are certain things, like I said, we could use these powers for evil, but there are certain gray areas that we have to consider. And so an example of this is choice supportive bias, which is basically the idea that we never make decisions in a vacuum. We always have to compare things to things. So let's say I'm a used car salesman, I bring you on the lot, and I have a sense of what I think I could get you to buy. So the first thing I'm going to show you, the first car is not the car I want you to buy. It is way out of your price range. It's really nice, but it's way out of your price range, and I know you're not going to buy it. So you say, no, I don't think I can handle that. So the next car I show you is pretty crappy. And I know it's within your price range, but I know you don't want it. And sure enough, you're like, oh, that's not great. I don't want that. Then I show you the car that I want you to buy. And it's a little bit better than the crappy car. And it's at a price point now that I want you to go for. And you're like, yeah, this is the one. Now, was that a dark pattern? I got what I wanted, and you got a car. What's the problem? Now, this is important for us because these patterns come up a lot, right? I'm going to show you 3 options, and one of those options is better for the business than the others. And I'm going to configure them in a way where the option that I want you to pick looks the best. And again, presumably you get what you want, I get what I want, no harm. When I was at UX Copenhagen, we started discussing this. And we didn't come up with a definitive answer, but we posited that what if there was like open source code for design, and if you could click on a button and find out why we chose this color or why we put this here or there. If you're willing to disclose why you've created that particular choice architecture, maybe it's not a dark pattern. If you'd rather not the user know why you did what you did, maybe you're trying to trick them. Maybe it is a dark pattern. It's food for thought. The most dangerous biases, though, for our users are our own. So there's this thing called notational bias. And it's basically the idea of you have a vision of how the world is, and that vision somehow makes it into your designs, especially into how you phrase things. So one example is sheet music. Right? I used to play saxophone, and I had to learn how to read sheet music, and I figured out that, oh, right, this is how all music in the world can be expressed. One way or another, if I can express it as sheet music, I can play it. Turns out there's a lot of music in the world that you absolutely cannot express using sheet music, mostly Eastern music. But by making this the default, I've basically erased lots of culture. A more common version of this for us is forms where we're asking for personal information. If I have a vision in my head that the only 2 genders, the only 2 ways you can define yourself are male and female, good for me, but I've just erased a whole bunch of different identities if I make that the default for you. By the way, we must be very, very careful how often we ask for personal information. There's this thing called projection bias. And the way it works is normally if I'm doing some kind of, like, let's say transaction online and it goes poorly, I will blame the computer unless I've given the computer a lot of my personal information. The more personal information I give the computer, the more I will blame myself if anything goes wrong. That's kind of messed up. And so we need to be very careful how often we ask for personal information. Be very, very, very sure you need it and only ask for what you need, because the more we do it, the more we are engendering a very weird relationship between people and computers. We also see this bias show up in structured content. So until 1986, you could not use the term Ms. when referring to women in the New York Times. And the way this worked is, at the first mention of a woman's name in a New York Times article, you would use her full name. Every subsequent mention of the name, you would either say Miss last name or Mrs. last name. Subconsciously, the message this sends is that the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she is married. Now imagine that, in article after article after article, structured in that way. You're sending out a message that is kind of making it easier for people to go around thinking that the most important thing about women is whether or not they are married. Structured content is very, very important. How we structure that content has a big impact. In fact, Mbiyo Gugomu, who works at IBM, said language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And this is actually true, like legally true. Back in the day, Dick Cheney, shrewd person that he is, had a very, very shrewd legal team. And that legal team said, hey, guess what? You are a member of the executive branch because you're the vice president, of course. But you're also Senate pro tem, which means you're also a member of the legislative branch. But you can't be both a member of the executive branch and a member of the legislative branch. So maybe you're not a member of either. And if you're not a member of either, you don't have to submit to the rules of either. And he didn't. We see the same thing today with Facebook. When it is convenient, Facebook is in publisher, right? You go there for content. Who do you go to for content? Publishers. But when someone wants them to submit to the rules of publishing, they say, whoa, 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 we are a platform. You can't make us do that, right? The names make a difference. Now, there are resources out there to help us think through how to be more inclusive in our language, what choices we make, and what choices we offer. Radical Copy Editor is one of them. Another is Textio. Let's go back to resumes. Say you're trying to write a resume, and you're going to want to encourage the most number of people to apply, and you don't want to use language that's going to make people think this job is not for them, because not everyone wants to be a ninja or a rock star. This will help you think through those choices. Another thing, and this is where I'm going to put a challenge, a design challenge out to all of you, is something that I wish English had that it doesn't. So there's a concept called evidentiality, and some languages have it, English does not. And it has to do with the verb tense. The way English uses verb tense is pretty straightforward, right? It lets you know when something happened, right? So Bob went to the store, Bob is going to the store, Bob will go to the store. Pretty straightforward. Other languages do a little extra work with tense. They let you know, how do I know that Bob went to the store? So there's one tense for, I personally saw Bob go to the store. There's another tense for, somebody told me that Bob went to the store. And there's a whole other tense for, like, I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. Now, I can't for the life of me imagine why it would be important in this day and age to know how people know things. But on the off chance that it's helpful, right, let's bring evidentiality into English using design. And my thought is, we've already said that if something is hard to read, we think it's less true. So, what if we acted on that? What if stuff that is not confirmed or unconfirmable was harder to read than the stuff that has been confirmed? So this is an actual article about the new 007 trailer, and the first paragraph has pretty confirmable facts. This is the name of the movie, the trailer has come out. The second paragraph is about a rumor about why the first director got fired. And it is harder to read, and is therefore harder to believe, and it should be because it's a rumor. In the real world, both of these paragraphs are just as easy to read, but they're not equally true, they're not equally confirmable. So, design challenge to all of you. Can we think of ways to bring evidentiality into design to make our users a little more aware of what is and isn't true? Confirmation bias, I told you we'd come back to that. I used to have a very wrong idea of what the scientific method was. I used to think the scientific method was basically I have an idea about how the world works, and I test out a hypothesis to see if I'm right. And if I'm right, I tell you what I did, and you all try it, and if you get the same result, yay, we've got a new law. That is not how it works. It's actually way more rigorous than that. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out it's much, much harder. It looks more like this. I have an idea about how the world works, and I try out my thing. Great, you try out the same thing. Great. Now, I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. That's the scientific method, right? I have to think, if I'm wrong, what else would be true? Let me see if I can prove that to be true, right? It's much more rigorous. And the scientific method was invented specifically to combat confirmation bias, to keep us from falling in love with the wrong idea. Now, it is very easy for us as designers to fall in love with design and then leave good design on the table, more elegant design. And it's so easy for it to happen. Let me show you. All right, here's a little computer game you can play. I've played it myself. The computer's gonna say, okay, put whatever number you want where that question mark is, and I will tell you if it fits the pattern. Put as many numbers in as you like, and when you're ready, tell me what you think the pattern is, right? And so if you're like me, you try 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, hold my beer, I got this. I don't need any more numbers. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says, no. And it says no because I didn't try that. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is just every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant pattern, it's a much more elegant solution, and it's way easier to code. I fell in love with the wrong idea, and I didn't try any other ideas. And God help us if we come up with a design that we like, and God help us even more if we come up with a design that our client likes, because we are going to be locked into that thing, even if it's the wrong design. Now, there are methods to combat this. There is a method that is used by both journalists and the military. How often do you hear that? It's called red team, blue team. And the way red team, blue team works is the blue team is composed of folks like yourself, and you do the design, you do the research, you put together the wireframes, you get just about to the point where you're ready to prototype, and you stop. And then the red team comes in for one day. And the red team's job is to go to war with the blue team. They're there to find every potential harmful side effect that you didn't think of because you were so in love with your first idea. Now, I like this idea because I don't have to go to my COO and say, hey, guess what? We need to spin up 2 teams for every project from now on just to check ourselves. No, I need one other team for one day to make sure that I'm not putting out something harmful into the world. Another way to approach this is speculative design. How many people here watch Black Mirror? Okay. For those of you who haven't seen it, Black Mirror is a show that's basically like the Twilight Zone, but for tech. You take some near-future tech, and you tell a story about it, about how actual humans would use it, and it's pretty much always horrible. I think that anyone working on a new technology by law should be required to write a Black Mirror episode about that technology. I think it would save us a lot of harm. But this is a real thing that people do. And a great example happened in the United Arab Emirates. So they were going to have a big energy conference to help figure out their energy strategy for the next, 20 years. And they had a firm come in and help them think through it. And the firm said, okay, let's assume you're going to stick with fossil fuels. We're going to tell you what your air quality is going to be like 10 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out. But they didn't just tell them. They made it. They made the air that they would have to breathe, and they bottled it. And they had them take a whiff. And by the time you get to even 10 years out, it is unbreathable. Now, I'm not going to say it's correlation or causation, but at the end of that conference, they said, we are going to invest billions with a B in renewables. The last bias I want to talk about is called Deformation Professionnelle. I told you I speak French. So it's basically the bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job, which in a workaholic society like ours might seem like a good idea until it's not. The press who ran Princess Di off the road that night probably thought they were doing an amazing job, and they kind of were. Technically, they were doing an amazing job. They were getting really difficult to get photographs that were going to fetch them an extremely high price. What they weren't doing such an amazing job at was being human beings. The former police commissioner of Philadelphia, when he got the job, asked his officers one question: what do you think your job is? And most of them said, our job is to enforce the law. And he said, that seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I were to tell you your job is to protect civil rights? Now that encompasses enforcing the law. I don't have a lot of civil rights if I'm dead, but it also means you have to treat people with dignity. It's a harder job than they thought it was. I will submit that our jobs are harder than we think. Our jobs are not simply make a bunch of cool stuff. And we have to find a way to define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, there are people already working on this. Mike Montero just released a little red book that's essentially a Hippocratic oath for designers, a first do no harm. And it's first of different ways to define yourself as a designer. He's also released an excellent book called Ruined by Design that can elaborate on all of that. The Markula Center for Applied Ethics has a great framework for thinking through ethical decisions. Step-by-step guide of different questions you can ask yourself as you're working on a design to ensure that it is, in fact, helping people. I literally, at the beginning of this week, stumbled across. Someone I met showed me this amazing thing called the Tarot Cards of Tech, and I highly encourage you to check this out today. It's basically just this really cool interface that gives you different ways to think about these ethical decisions, right? And they're literally cards, and you sort of click on them, and it gives you some design challenges to think through what is the impact of what you're working on. Humane by Design is a fantastic website that gives you all sorts of interface. It's almost like a design system for ethical tech, but it gives you all these different ways to think about your design with visual cues. TurboTax, when they released their new chat feature, they came up with a brand new design system for it. And they decided it was part of their job to think about how gender would be represented in that design system. It wasn't an afterthought, it was part of the process. I don't totally love where they landed with it, but what I do love is that they thought it was part of their job. We're seeing this in software engineering as well. There's a never again pledge that tech workers can take that basically says, look, we're not going to work on ethical things. If you ask us to do this, we're going to go on strike. In fact, Project Maven was a Google project that was going to produce Battlefield AI. And Google straight up went on strike. Their engineers got together and said, we are not going to work on this. We didn't get into this business to make weapons. We're not going to do this. And Google buckled. They walked away from a $250 million contract with the government, and the strikers won until Dragonfly came along, and then Google decided they wanted to do censored search in China, and the strikers started trying to organize again. This one hasn't completely resolved itself yet. But it kind of shows you where we're going. By the way, who comes up with these like Bond villain names for things, right? Like some adult actually put that in an email. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. This isn't some Silicon Valley guru at a TED Talk. This is Martin Luther King. 50 years ago, he saw this. And it's just as true, if not more true today. So the challenge that I will give all of us is to find a way to define our jobs that allows us to be more human to each other. Thank you. Do you have time for questions?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, cool. Could we have time for a couple questions? If anyone has? Yeah, I can get that to you. I'm going to post the slides from this, and people can see that. But and I think it actually says in the reference. But if we exchange cards later, I can track that down. Because a friend of mine who works in public health in Philadelphia gave that to me in a bigger report, so I can probably send you the whole thing. Yeah. Okay. So one more. Just okay. Okay, so the question was, like, should you put your photo in LinkedIn? Because this hiring manager right here, like, that's where they're going to go, right? All right, two things real quick. One, I just want to say, long game, blind resumes are not the solution. They're a Band-Aid over a much larger systemic problem. It should actually be a good thing, like your identity is your diversity. It's contributing. I should be happy to see the whole you when I'm hiring you. Systemic racism, pattern recognition, and all that stuff is making that more difficult. So it's, just to clarify, it is a Band-Aid over that. So someday I should be telling you, absolutely put your picture in there. I want to see all of you. That having been said, there are studies where if you are a minority, they kind of call it whitewashing or whitening your resume. It saddens me to tell you it works. Statistically, it works. African Americans who have applied for jobs and have basically eliminated anything in the resume, including the photo, that makes it harder to think that you are not white, have done better statistically. It's shameful but true. You may want to ask yourself, do you want to work for a place where it's increasing your odds to reveal your whole self? That's an absolutely fair question. But so if I'm being purely practical, I might say, if you think that this is a job that is going to be, it's going to be counted against you, you might want to, and it's like, I need the job. I might say, yeah, you might not want to have your photo in there. It feels so gross to say that, but just statistically, if I'm just doing the math, that's the case. Okay, if you have other questions, I am around all day. Thanks.